extraordinary verbal facility. And this is actually what won me to it in the first place. My reputation as a public speaker is based on my supposedly dazzling oratorical abilities, but I come out of a peer group, a karass in Berkeley, where everyone was able to do what I do. Everyone seemed to be able to hold forth for hours on the most arcane subjects. And in fact, when I got into cannabis, the style of doing it that I enjoyed most was I ran a kind of cannabis salon, as it were. And people came and they smoked and they talked and talked and talked. And this is all we did was talk. And no recordings exist of that era, but I believe that the conversation was brilliant, wide-ranging, prescient, to the point, and extraordinarily creative and capable of astonishing. And I give complete credit to cannabis for that. I remember the second time that I smoked cannabis, I was a great fan of Herman Melville at that time, and my friend and I smoked some cannabis and then called on some young women at a dormitory that we were courting at that time, and we went into the visitors' room of the dormitory, and I was able to hold forth for an hour in a pseudo-Melvillian style. I created on the spot, without hesitation, a short story in the style of Herman Melville that was dazzling, apparently, to my hearers. Well, this is verbal facility of an extraordinary sort. The other area where I think it has an important role to play that we haven't talked about is in sexual performance and sexual stamina. When I first became sexually active, and I think this is a problem of many young men simply because they have so much juice going, is premature ejaculation. All my sexual encounters were haunted by that possibility simply because I was just so hyped up over the idea of having intercourse with someone. Well, I discovered that smoking hashish gave me an incredible ability to control my ejaculation and also my sexual stamina. So these were invaluable social skills. It gave me verbal facility, sexual stamina, control over my ejaculation, beautiful visions, a prodigious memory. It did everything but suppress appetite, which it certainly did not do. The munchies, regardless of what pharmacologists tell us about how this is an illusion, the munchies seem to be a very real part of cannabis use, meaning that 40 minutes or an hour after smoking cannabis, one does find oneself rummaging through the cupboard looking for chocolate chip cookies. But this is hardly grounds for hanging, which is the current legal response in Malaysia.
My impression, Terence, is that your experience is not typical, and most of the things you described, I would say, are typical of my experience personally.
And mine.
But in Santa Cruz, I remember after the 60s came and went, there was, this is a community that was very involved in the marijuana trade in the 70s, let's say. There were a certain number of people who were habitual users, I would say habitual smokers, as you were, and it seemed as if they couldn't get their life together. Unlike you, they were functional, they could stack the wood, but they never got on to doing what they wanted to do. And I did begin to associate a certain subtle disorganization with their habitual smoking. This is a different, a slightly more mild form of this negative effect that Rupert described in India, where people are truly addicted and in a subhuman state. That, I think, requires taking really deep inhalations of cannabis with a chillum. But there are, let's say, for the sake of discussion, that there is a negative side beyond what you have experienced in case of heavy use. And even so, it's, I think, very modest compared to the negative side of heavy use of alcohol, and is very insignificant in comparison with the very positive effects of cannabis use in a society, which in the case of alcohol, I don't know of any. There might be, some people can tell amazing alcohol stories where they really have been able to work wonderful while intoxicated, but basically I think it's agreed that while relaxing in small doses is good for your health, it has a negative influence. It brings up the question, then, I know you both thought about this, why is it, how is it that cannabis, in spite of these beneficial effects, its benignness and so on, is so strongly regulated and forbidden all over the planet now? One idea I know from previous, that since cannabis is the orphic drug, it's associated with the goddess, and then in the patriarchal takeover, of course, it was one of the things that was knocked from the pedestal along with chaos and the goddess. But even now, in this modern society where we have no recourse to these opiates, and people are not really afraid of the goddess re-emerging, there's this incredibly expensive drug war going on. People are not speaking of cannabis now, I think, because the atmosphere for it is much more hostile today than even 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I used to speak about my experience with psychedelics in class. Now I wouldn't. It's better not to. Not because the police are going to come and carry me away, but the immediate reaction of these people I'm trying to communicate with is going to be very, very negative. More negative than if I was alcoholic and been put in jail for driving while intoxicated. So some kind of paranoia about whatever cannabis represents to people, its significance in the mythological, this paranoia is on the increase in this decade, and I wonder why you think that is.
Well, first may I say that I think this paranoia is somewhat polarized, in that there is a rising paranoia in the United States, which has partly been exported to countries like Malaysia. The paranoia about cannabis in Europe is definitely on the decline. Cannabis has been effectively decriminalized in Holland, in Switzerland, in Italy, even in Britain, even in the Thatcher regime. There was an article recently in the newspapers saying that something like 90% of the people the police catch with small amounts of cannabis are now let off with a caution, not even fined. In Italy, the possession of small quantities of cannabis is not a criminal offence, and even somewhat slightly larger ones is treated on a par with parking offences. You get a ticket or something, minor fines. And the movement, even in Britain, which is probably the most closest to America in its in general attitudes in Europe, there's been a progressive attitude on the part of the police and even increasing numbers of legislators and judges towards decriminalizing the use of cannabis. De facto, in small quantities, this has actually happened. So rather than zero tolerance being the rule, there's in fact been an increasing tolerance in most European societies to the use of cannabis over the last decade. And full-scale legalization may not yet have come, but this has happened de facto in various parts of Europe. There are streets of Zurich, for example, where you can sit in the street at cafes and smoke